I'm not saying it's, that it was right for me to take another person's life, but, sometimes it has to happen. Being Mexican is a certain way that we live our life, a certain machismo that we use. I couldn't sit there and just watch some guy beat up a woman. It's not gonna happen. But when I seen him coming, I looked over and yeah, we're gonna see who kills who, huh? Kind of weird to explain. You think be a little more nervous, but it's more of a, man, it's gonna happen. Almost like getting your first kiss.
I started off like that.
I just wanted to rebel. I wanted to cause chaos. I looked over and we're gonna see who kills who, huh?
I made the choice. I took his life.
It's something that I've never intended to do. I wish I didn't do.
I knew I was going to get out of that corner and murder those two men.
And as he kneeled in front of me, all I remember is pulling the trigger.
I killed them both. I had stabbed them to death.
It was early in the morning when I got the call. Get in the car and drove way out here. This was the furthest south that I'd had any crime scenes in a while. I'd been in homicide for about 10 years. You never know what you're going to find. You never know what the surprise is going to be. There was a car up against the concrete center barriers. There was a body of the driver behind the steering wheel. These drive-by type shootings, road rage type shootings, often are difficult to solve. There were shell casings on the ground, which changed what I'd originally thought of someone being shot at along the roadway. Someone bothered to come right up to the window where this person was helplessly behind the wheel and shoot them again. Whoever it was really wanted this person dead.
Can you hear me? My name is Mark St. Arthur, and I'm doing a capital life sentence for capital murder. Took place in Houston, Texas. Growing up as a kid, I visited family in Mexico and Chicago, but most of my life was spent in Houston and the surrounding suburbs. Nowhere near wealthy growing up, but my mom did the best, you know. She worked pretty hard to take care of us. My mother's Mexican Indian. She always tried to take good care of me, but I was a bit rebellious. I've never met my biological father. He was real abusive, did like me for whatever reason. He hit me with a closed fist. He used to get picked up, thrown to the other side of the room, kicked around. I seen him beat her up. When I actually saw it happen in front, that a man or a so-called man would put his hands on a woman like that. He grabbed her by the hair and punched on her. I was too little to do anything about it. The guy I looked up to, the one that I called my father, was Homer Milbourne. Took care of my mom, told her after they got married a few years, he didn't even want her to work. He just said the man takes care of his wife. In just a few years, he taught me a lot. I never talked about him since he died, so it's weird I actually break down in front of you and I've never cried since he died. He's the one that actually told me to start respecting my mom and that I should get my shit together. I wound up joining the Maniac Latin Disciple Nation, which is a member of the Folks Alliance. We're a brotherhood, a fraternal bond that we believe in the better growth and development of our neighborhoods, our people, our culture. You mess with one, you mess with all. One love, one hate. Never was really into using drugs or drinking alcohol. I just wasn't very good at sports or anything like that, so I tried to show that I was good at fighting or shooting or whatever else it took to establish my dominance. When I was about 14, I got real close with a guy named Ezekiel Fonseca. We were both pretty good at chasing girls and getting into fights with some of the same rivals and same gangs. We were both into breaking into cars, breaking into houses, robbed a few people. Most of the time it was my idea, so I was like, hey man, you wanna come on? He's like, yeah, sure. So, you know, why wouldn't you want to hang around with a guy that, you know, always in doing something exciting? I'd go to sleep over at his place or hang out there for a couple of days. His mom was always cool with us and, you know, help give us something to eat or let us hang around, and, you know, everybody kind of Looked up to her as a mother figure. I was real close to her. She never told his dad that we were out there getting in trouble and stuff, so I pretty much stayed away from my house all the time because there's too many rules there. Me and little Ezekiel, so we hung out pretty well until he went to prison when I was 16. I wasn't there for it, so I don't know exactly what happened. When I came by his house, his mom was beat up pretty bad. She had a couple plugs of hair missing out of her head. She'd been burned with a curling iron, black eyes. I was like, man, have you been fighting with a man? You know? And she's like, yeah, and that's when she told me that she got beat up by her husband, which is Ezekiel Fonseca, the senior. I'm opposed to physical abuse on women because I kind of felt bad that I couldn't help my sister. When at that time, but now I'm big enough that I could help my friend's mom. So I stood up for her when I couldn't stand up for my sister. I guess they tried to redeem myself. I waited around, went ahead and kicked his ass. And I beat him up pretty bad now. After I beat him up, he told me he was gonna kill me. If you threaten my life, you're surely putting your own at risk. I think probably about 2 weeks went by after Big Zeke made his little threat. Then I made up my mind that I was gonna go ahead and get him first. I was in the passenger side. I had Mason driving the car. I didn't really tell him exactly what I was gonna do. I know that Big Zeke come home from work not too long after sunset. I know the location of the place. So I was waiting for him. And sure enough, right, not too long after I drove over there, I seen him come by. Here's my chance to make my bones, do what I'm gonna do. I was mad at him for what he did. Mad at the way that he talked to me. Mad at what he did to my friend's mom. And I pulled next to him. Our windows were side by side with each other. Then when I saw the light illuminate through the moonroof, got a good look at him, I looked over and yeah, that's him, huh? Mason was kind of surprised when I pulled out a handgun. And turned it around into the handgun and unloaded the clip onto him. Just kept on going till there wasn't no bullets left. Pretty much didn't have no choice but just keep driving, though. I didn't want to focus on it. I mean, it's done, it's done. It's either him or me type of deal, and he's my enemy, so. Hell with him. we all got arrested. Police and then Harris County came by there when they found out I was in custody. Took me to Harris County. I knew I was caught red-handed, so I went in and told them everything that I did. It was a misconception of the newspapers, you know, saying it was a relationship type of deal, but it was more, I looked at her more like a homegirl. According to the Harris County Sheriff Department, they said that she told me, go ahead and kill Ezekiel, we'll split the money. And that's not anything that took place. The whole reason why I offed the guy, because he told me he was gonna kill me. And I lied, I didn't like him. Found out that I could make an affidavit and let them know that, hey man, she had nothing to do with this. So I tried my best to, if you didn't have nothing to do with it, there's no reason for me to get her involved in my wrongdoings.
Good job, dear. You're a good girl. I met Mark in 1993, January. He was 14 at the time. I was 18. Interesting young man. He was still a kid, but he joined us in things that we did, so he kind of felt like an adult. Put off the aura of I'm a tough guy. I never met any of his friends that he talked about. Oh yeah, we're gangsters, part of a gang. But we never saw any of them. So I didn't quite believe him in that sense. He thought he was, I don't know, a gangster. Suddenly, out of the blue one day, I just get this letter in the mail from Mark. He didn't know my new address, and somehow he found me. But I guess if you want something on the inside, you can get it. He had written that he had gotten into some trouble, and would I write to him? Would I help him in any way? Write to him, talk to him, see if I can get him out? I was very surprised. Capital murder is a big, that's a big crime. I did write to him. I wrote back. And then he explained that he was in love with a woman that was older than him named Carmen, and that he would never be with her again. And that was the saddest part of his life at that time. Saddest part. I don't know. Your first heartache, your first love, that never goes away.
My name is Jesse Sanchez Sr., and my relationship to Mark is I'm his uncle. His mom is my sister. Mark didn't get the attention from his mom because he didn't have a father around, so he didn't get the attention from his mom either because she was leaving him with babysitters and relatives because she was in relationship. She pretty much pushed him aside. So that I'm sure affected Mark. He didn't believe anybody that really loved him or cared for him. And I'm sure he was looking for acceptance in addition to affection outside the family. Carmen used her body, sex, and then the money. She didn't pull the trigger, but she influenced him to the point where she got him to do what she wanted him to do. He felt like, well, she's accepting me, she loves me, so I'm going to do this for her. And he got manipulated into doing something that he, you know, was paying. He's paying with his life.
Once I was sitting there in prison, I thought about my friend's mom, Carmen. It was a misconception of the newspapers, you know, saying it was a relationship type of deal. I looked at her more like a homegirl. According to the Harris County Sheriff Department, they said that she told me, go ahead and kill Ezekiel, we'll split the money. And that's not anything that took place. The whole reason why I off the guy, because he told me he was gonna kill me. And I lied, I didn't like him.
Yeah, he's not telling the truth. It's hard to understand why somebody would do that after spending this many years behind bars and still saying, no, she had nothing to do with it. To me, it's just like, you know, he's just trying to do the honorable thing and just take the whole rap and not implicate nobody else. But it's not very honorable to protect somebody that used you and manipulated you to do something like that. If he's still saying that today, and it's hard to understand why. For him to continue to say that it was just him, just doesn't make sense. You know, he needs to come clean and tell the truth. Because loyalty and honorable is no good behind bars.
My name is Patrick McCann. I'm a criminal defense attorney, and I was one of the two counsel that represented Carmen Fonseca at her trial. The state tried to portray her as sort of an evil, seductive mastermind. Their theory was that she had put Mark up to this in return for either sexual favors or part of the money. Our theory was that Mark wanted Ezekiel dead so he could have his woman and his house and his car. It made no sense whatsoever. The story that they concocted, although fun and interesting and maybe a good subject for a movie, was not real. If you genuinely hate the guy, then there should have been some evidence of that in the family history, and there really wasn't. I mean, there was evidence that the marriage was not going well, but you know, that sums up probably half the marriages in the country. And if you knew Carmen, she wasn't, you know, she may not have been the most sophisticated person, but she was also not a person who had any violence in her. I believe Carmen Fonseca was innocent of this crime. I think clearly Mark was the driving force. He decided that this would be his somehow oddly, sickly romantic gift to Carmen, to give her a new life that he could be part of. But that was his fantasy, not hers.
Every birthday I get artwork. Happy Halloween. He likes Valentine's Day. He likes Halloween. I don't know why he would send this to me. But it looks like a vampire woman biting another woman's breast. $350 letters. He writes to me a lot more than I write to him, though. And I'm sorry about that. It's just life does get in the way out here. He has more time to write than I do. It tells basically the story of his life in prison. I believe it gives a good account of what's going on in there, only it's from one perspective. It would be from Mark's perspective. July 19th of 2001. He says, "Say, your postcards are fine with me. Hell, at least you send something and you write once every week. Thank you. My existence would sure really suck if not for you. And so don't feel bad because I know that you love me." Interesting choice of words. He's like, "I really appreciate over the years just you sticking by my side." That was in there. That was important to me too. So over the years, Mark has written to me and he has disclosed to me the events that led up to the murder of Ezekiel. What he told me was that basically he was seeing an older woman named Carmen who was married to a man named Ezekiel, and that he had been seeing Carmen for a while and that she had gotten pregnant by Mark. Ezekiel found out and beat her to the point where she miscarried at 8 months. So the interpretation I get out of his letters is that he wanted revenge for killing his child. A life for a life.
My name's Kyle Brown. I investigated homicides. My role in this case was as the lead investigator. During the course of our investigation of the murder of Ezekiel Fonseca, we found that the person who killed him, Mark Arthur, had a relationship with Ezekiel's wife, Carmen. Ezekiel's wife convinced Mark that if he would kill her husband, he would get Ezekiel's brand new car, he would get to live in the house, he would get to continue to be her boyfriend, her lover, he would get access and the ability to not have Ezekiel looking over him and just be able to continue his little life of crime, coming and going, living there in the home. Her motivation was to get rid of Ezekiel, and there was insurance money involved. They had a detailed plan. They had worked it out together. And the reason we know this is Mark Arthur told us.
Somewhere else. That's a new building here pretty quick.
That's good.
You get your offices here. And you mentioned you'll be brought in. They're supposed to be building us a new building here pretty quick.
That's good. That's good.
That's fine.
Oh, yeah, I'll be closer. Okay.
When we interviewed Mark, Mark immediately told us everything that he had been doing. Mark told us all about his motivation, all about the setup of Ezekiel Fonseca, all about being asked to do this crime.
How many times has she asked you to kill him?
This is the first time that she brought up the idea that she wouldn't mind him being killed, but she's never actually brought anything to my attention until that day.
He immediately went to that as his motivation. That she'd asked him to do it. She'd asked him to do it, and he was going to be rewarded for doing it. There's no question. Matter of fact, I referred to this constantly throughout years when people refer to this as more of a contract killing than any crime of passion.
I was like, when? She said, now. I said, what? I told her, I said, well, when he gets off work. She's like, yeah, he gets off at 7 and takes the boat. I said, all right, cool.
He was very, very straightforward with us and told us about his participation with our victim's wife. He told us about that being a plan. He told us about everything to do with their setup of our victim, of her husband. Couldn't stop him from talking.
I told him to move around the car, so I let off a few more shots.
Did you see any blood or anything at the time?
I seen the hole in his temple. And I reached in there and I put like one leg on the long side of the car. I got long, skinny legs. And I was like sitting in between like a saddle, I guess. I was pushing his ass up and I got another hand and I was like pushing the wallet out.
Does anybody promise you anything to get you to say this or anything?
No.
He liked to brag. He liked to talk about how he had done his crimes, and almost as if it was a badge of honor, almost as if it was that it made him a tough guy. Matter of fact, he said that casually. He said, I've been on my little, I've had my fun, and I'm gonna go do a little time now, and then I'll get out.
Yeah. Sure.
I didn't get the impression from him that he was anybody's rescuer or savior. I got more the impression that he was the person that came up to people and took what he wanted from them when he wanted it, at whatever cost it was to them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You have a collect call.
Let's cut the bullshit. You know I did it.
What?
You know I did. And you know I did this shit for you.
You say a lot of shit, Mark, and a lot of it has been lies. Man, don't be trying to fuck me around, because I promise if you try to fuck me, I'm gonna fuck you with
I'm not trying to do anything.
Hey, I ain't gonna take this bullshit by myself, I promise. And I know you can get me the fuck out of here.
How am I gonna get you out?
I don't know, find some fucking way.
You didn't tell me anything. What do you want me to tell him? I don't know anything. But that's all I told him. I don't know what else to do. I don't know how else to help you.
You listen to this, he's clearly guilty. He's clearly trying to implicate her. She's not having it. As soon as his hide was on the line, then he goes from being, you know, this romantic savior to what he actually is, which is an animal that no one has ever disciplined or trained. He turned on that woman almost immediately in order to gain some better deal. And that is why she's still in jail today.
I think he'll get out eventually. But I don't know if he'll ever be sorry for what he's done. He's just sorry he's in jail. Without remorse in his heart, I don't think that anyone who's in prison, much less Mark, should get out. The mentality he has is still, as a young man, I think, even from his writings. And from his writings, the mentality is, I want, therefore I get. And that's not how life works out here. Okay, you can't just want something, somebody get in your way, and buzz, you know, take care of that, and then I get what I want. It doesn't work that way. He should have learned that a long time ago. He was a violent person as a young kid. He's still violent in the prison system. And that doesn't mean that when he gets out, he's suddenly not violent anymore. And that scares me. He'd never hurt me. No. No, he'd never hurt me. I don't believe that. But that doesn't mean he couldn't hurt others around me. That's scary.
I did something wrong, and I've been punished for it. I did the most horrible thing you could do, is take somebody's life. I can't stress enough, you know what I mean, that I'm not the same person I was. One of the good things about it, being in prison, is you're forced to sit down, look at yourself, evaluate yourself. Like, man, if I want to get out of here, how do I get out of here? Well, one of the things is I got to make some changes, because the stuff that I was doing this is where it got me.
Carmen used her body, sex, and then the money. She didn't pull the trigger, but she influenced him to the point where she got him to do what she wanted him to do.
To a certain degree, I could say that my family's correct because she's somebody I cared about. She's a friend of mine. Of course, there's some emotional ties there. So yeah, I would want you to feel better. So when I found out that Carmen was hurt, I wanted to do whatever I could to make sure that she wasn't hurt no more. The way that people outside of my life would see it is be like, hey, they really had something going on, and it was nothing. It's my friend's mom, and I can say we're more friends than it was any type of girlfriend or lover or anything like that. We had sex, but it's a couple times, and then after that, it's over with. As far as her asking me to go kill him, no. I don't know where that would come from.
How many times she asked you to kill him?
This is the first time that she brought up the idea that she wouldn't mind him being killed, but she's never actually brought anything to my attention until that day. I showed her the glide, she's telling me that would be good to do it.
I did make statements, let them record me and all this, but I did it under false pretense. I let them mislead me into believing that, hey, look, if you could just help us, we're gonna help you, and you might get no more than 10 years, you might get probation. I wish the moment that I was arrested, I wish I'd just shut the hell up and whatever happened, happened. These things wasn't supposed to go anywhere. There was supposed to be, it wasn't supposed to be used against her. None of this there wasn't gonna be any punishment towards them. My talking too much got her screwed over. I fell for it. And I ruined people's lives, my own, my family's, Carmen's, and anybody that cared about either one of us.
What he told me was that basically he had been seeing Carmen for a while and that she had gotten pregnant by Mark. Ezekiel found out and beat her to the point where she miscarried at 8 months. So the interpretation I get out of his letters is that he wanted revenge for killing his child. A life for a life.
So that way we get the record clear for this. The thing that got Ezekiel Fonseca killed is him threatening my life. The thing that got him beat up was him beating up my friend's mom. There's that, as far as the possibility of it being because of her getting pregnant, who wouldn't be pissed off, about? I don't even know if that was my kid. I don't even know if she was pregnant by me. If that was my, kid, yeah, I'm gonna be mad about that. So that, the possibility of that might have been my kid is in my head. I don't know for a fact that was my kid, but if it was, then yeah, he deserved it. That would have got him killed, yeah.
In the early 1970s, Fort Worth, Texas, was one of the fastest growing cities in the American Southwest. New neighborhoods expanded toward the suburbs, shopping centers attracted families on weekends, and high school football dominated Friday nights. For many teenagers, life revolved around school events, summer jobs, and evenings spent with friends. Parents often believed their communities were safe enough for young people to enjoy a degree of independence that would become less common in later decades. Against that backdrop, 17-year-old Carla Jan Walker was preparing for adulthood. Friends and family described her as outgoing, responsible, and well-liked. She attended Western Hills High School and had recently begun planning for life after graduation. Like many teenagers, she enjoyed spending time with friends, attending school events, and dating her boyfriend, Rodney McCoy. The evening of February 16th, Sill 1974, appeared entirely ordinary. Carla and Rodney attended a Valentine's Day dance sponsored by their high school. The event brought together students for music, dancing, and celebration. Photographs from the era show formal dresses, tuxedos, and smiling faces, images that reflected what was expected to be a memorable night for dozens of young couples. After the dance ended, Carla and Rodney decided to stop briefly before heading home. They parked in the lot near a bowling alley in western Fort Worth, a location where teenagers sometimes gathered after school events. According to Rodney's later statements to investigators, the two remained inside his vehicle talking as the evening drew to a close. Shortly before midnight, the routine ended abruptly. Rodney later reported that an unknown man approached the vehicle while armed with a handgun. According to his account, the individual forced his way into the encounter, demanded compliance, and ordered both teenagers out of the car. During the struggle that followed, Rodney was assaulted and rendered unable to stop the attacker. Carla was forced into another vehicle, and the assailant left the scene. Rodney immediately sought help after regaining the ability to do so. Police officers responded quickly, interviewing him while the events were still fresh in his memory. Detectives recognized the seriousness of the situation from the outset. At that stage, investigators treated the incident as an active kidnapping involving a missing teenager whose location and condition were unknown. Search efforts began almost immediately. Law enforcement officers distributed descriptions, interviewed potential witnesses, and examined the area surrounding the bowling alley for physical evidence. Detectives documented the condition of Rodney's vehicle, collected items that might assist the investigation, and attempted to determine whether anyone nearby had observed suspicious activity that evening. The investigation unfolded during an era very different from today's criminal justice environment. There were no mobile phones recording locations, no security cameras monitoring parking lots, and no digital communications capable of tracing movements in real time. Investigators instead relied upon witness interviews, physical evidence, neighborhood canvasses, and traditional investigative methods. As news of Carla's disappearance spread throughout Fort Worth, concern quickly intensified. Missing person cases involving teenagers often generated significant public attention, particularly when witnesses reported an apparent abduction. Local newspapers carried updates, radio stations broadcast appeals for information, and residents contacted police with observations that they believed might assist the investigation. Detectives carefully reconstructed Carla's known movements throughout the day. They interviewed family members, friends, classmates, and individuals who had attended the school dance. Their objective was to establish a complete timeline, determine whether anyone had noticed unusual behavior, and identify any person who might have had prior contact with the victim. Rodney McCoy became one of the investigation's most important witnesses because he had been present during the abduction. Detectives conducted multiple interviews to document his recollection of events, the physical description of the attacker, and any details concerning the vehicle involved. Public records indicate that he consistently maintained that the assailant was a stranger and that the attack occurred without warning. Despite the urgency of the investigation, investigators faced immediate challenges. The offender had acted quickly, leaving relatively little opportunity for eyewitnesses to observe the crime. Darkness, limited visibility, and the available forensic techniques of 1974 could not provide the range of investigative tools that would later become standard in homicide investigations. 2 days later, on February 18th, still 1974, the investigation took a tragic turn. Carla Walker's body was discovered in a culvert in a rural area of Johnson County, south of Fort Worth. The discovery confirmed that the missing person investigation had become a homicide investigation. Medical examination determined that Carla had died from homicidal violence. Public court records and law enforcement statements have documented that she had also been sexually assaulted. Detectives immediately processed the scene, carefully collecting physical evidence according to the forensic standards available at the time. The location where Carla was found presented investigators with new questions. Detectives sought to determine whether the site had been chosen because it was isolated or whether it had some connection to the offender. They examined tire impressions, trace evidence, and surrounding terrain while attempting to reconstruct how the victim had been transported from Fort Worth to Johnson County. Meanwhile, officers continued examining the original abduction scene. Crime scene investigators processed Rodney McCoy's automobile, searching for fingerprints, fibers, hair, and any biological material that might identify the offender. Although DNA profiling had not yet been developed as a forensic technique, investigators nevertheless preserved biological evidence whenever possible, recognizing that scientific advances might eventually permit additional analysis. The murder profoundly affected the Fort Worth community. Parents who had once viewed school dances and familiar gathering places as relatively safe reconsidered long-held assumptions about public safety. Schools, community organizations, and local media continued following developments in the investigation as detectives worked to identify the unknown assailant. During the weeks that followed, investigators received numerous tips from members of the public. Detectives interviewed individuals who believed they had observed suspicious vehicles or unfamiliar persons in the area. Others reported rumors or information that they hoped might assist law enforcement. As with many major homicide investigations, each lead required careful evaluation before it could be confirmed or eliminated. Despite extensive investigative work, no immediate arrest followed. Detectives preserved physical evidence, maintained detailed investigative records, and continued searching for witnesses capable of identifying the person responsible. Although significant questions remained unanswered, investigators recognized that the evidence collected during those first critical days might become increasingly important as forensic science advanced in the years ahead. For Carla Walker's family, however, the immediate concern was not the future of forensic science, but the devastating loss of a daughter whose life had ended only days after an ordinary evening at a high school dance. For the investigators assigned to the case, the homicide became one of Fort Worth's most significant unsolved murders, a case that would remain open for decades, waiting for scientific developments that no one in 1974 could yet imagine. On February 18th, still 1974, 2 days after Carla Walker was reported missing, authorities received information that led them to a rural area in Johnson County, approximately 30 miles south of Fort Worth. There, investigators discovered Carla Walker's body in a drainage culvert near a county road. The discovery marked the transition of the investigation from a missing person case to a homicide investigation. Law enforcement officers immediately secured the scene to preserve potential evidence. Crime scene technicians photographed the location, documented the surrounding terrain, and recorded the position of physical evidence before any items were collected. These procedures, standard for homicide investigations, were intended to ensure that later forensic examinations and court proceedings could rely on accurate documentation of the scene as it had originally been found. The Office of the Medical Examiner conducted an autopsy to determine the cause and manner of death. Public records established that Carla Walker had been sexually assaulted and murdered. The findings confirmed that investigators were dealing with a violent criminal offense and broadened the scope of the investigation. Attention quickly turned to reconstructing the timeline between Carla's abduction on the night of February 16th and the discovery of her body 2 days later. Detectives interviewed Carla's family, friends, classmates, and her boyfriend, Rodney McCoy, who had been present during the abduction. Rodney provided investigators with a description of the events as he remembered them, including his account that an armed man confronted the couple while they were sitting in a parked vehicle after a school dance. Investigators examined the parking lot where the abduction occurred. Crime scene personnel searched for fingerprints, tire impressions, discarded objects, and any trace evidence that might have been left by the offender. Rodney's automobile was processed for forensic evidence using the techniques available in 1974. Although DNA profiling would not become available for criminal investigations until many years later, investigators collected and preserved biological material whenever possible because it might prove useful through future scientific advances. The investigation extended across multiple jurisdictions. While the abduction occurred in Fort Worth, the victim's body was recovered in Johnson County. As a result, law enforcement agencies coordinated investigative responsibilities, exchanged reports, and shared forensic findings. Detectives sought to determine the route the offender may have taken and whether any witnesses had observed suspicious vehicles traveling through the area during the relevant period. Public appeals for information generated numerous leads. Residents reported unfamiliar vehicles, suspicious individuals, and observations they believed might be connected to the investigation. Detectives evaluated each tip by comparing witness statements with known facts, establishing timelines, and attempting to corroborate information through additional interviews or physical evidence. As is common in major homicide investigations, many leads could not ultimately be substantiated. The forensic capabilities of the mid-1970s presented significant limitations. Investigators relied heavily on eyewitness testimony, physical evidence visible at the crime scenes, fingerprint comparisons, and laboratory examinations of fibers, hairs, and other trace material. While these methods were valuable, they often could not identify an unknown offender in the absence of a suspect for comparison. Despite those limitations, investigators recognized the importance of preserving all available evidence. Clothing, biological samples, photographs, and laboratory reports were retained as part of the case file. That decision would later become one of the most significant aspects of the investigation, as advances in forensic DNA analysis would eventually allow evidence collected in 1974 to be examined using technologies that did not exist at the time of the original investigation. During the weeks following the discovery of the crime scene, detectives continued pursuing leads while maintaining regular communication with Carla Walker's family. Although the investigation remained active, no arrest was made. As months turned into years, the homicide gradually became one of Fort Worth's most significant unsolved murder cases, with investigators preserving the evidence in the hope that future developments in forensic science or new investigative information might eventually identify the person responsible. The homicide investigation into the death of Carla Walker entered a critical phase after investigators completed their initial examination of both the abduction site in Fort Worth and the location in Johnson County where her body was discovered. With no immediate suspect identified, The success of the investigation depended heavily on the physical evidence recovered during the earliest hours of the case. Crime scene investigators followed the forensic procedures available in 1974. Every item believed to have potential evidentiary value was photographed, documented, packaged, and preserved according to the standards of the time. Detectives understood that physical evidence could provide objective information that witness testimony alone could not. Although the available laboratory techniques were limited compared with those of later decades, investigators recognized the importance of preserving material for future examination if additional scientific methods became available. At the original abduction scene, investigators processed Rodney McCoy's vehicle for fingerprints, trace evidence, and signs of the struggle he had described. They examined the vehicle's interior and exterior, searching for hair, fibers, biological material, and latent fingerprints that might identify the unknown offender. The surrounding parking area was also examined for physical evidence, including tire impressions and objects that could be linked to the incident. At the recovery site in Johnson County, crime scene personnel conducted a systematic examination of the area. They documented the condition of the scene, searched nearby terrain for discarded items, and collected trace evidence that might indicate how the offender had transported or left the victim. Investigators attempted to determine whether the location had been selected deliberately or simply provided a remote area where the offender believed discovery would be delayed. The medical examination provided additional forensic information. Public court records indicate that biological evidence was collected during the autopsy. Although the significance of this material could not be fully understood in 1974, standard forensic practice required its preservation because it could potentially assist future laboratory analysis. One of the greatest investigative challenges during this period was the absence of DNA profiling. Modern criminal investigations often rely upon DNA comparisons to identify or exclude suspects, but this capability did not exist when Carla Walker was murdered. Instead, forensic laboratories focused on examinations of blood type, microscopic hair comparison, fiber analysis, fingerprint identification, and other techniques available at the time. Blood typing could sometimes narrow the pool of possible suspects, but it rarely identified a specific individual. Hair comparison allowed examiners to determine whether samples appeared microscopically similar, yet the method could not establish identity with certainty. Fiber analysis helped investigators compare materials found on clothing or vehicles, but these comparisons generally provided associative rather than conclusive evidence. Fingerprints remained one of the most reliable forms of identification, but only if usable prints had been recovered and could be matched to a known individual. Investigators also depended heavily on witness interviews. Rodney McCoy's account of the abduction became a central component of the investigation. Detectives carefully documented his recollections, recognizing that eyewitness memory can change over time. They compared his statements with physical evidence recovered from the scene in an effort to establish a consistent reconstruction of the events. As the investigation expanded, detectives interviewed numerous individuals who might have seen suspicious vehicles or unfamiliar persons in the vicinity of the abduction. Local residents, business employees, and motorists were asked to recall observations made on the evening of February 16, 1974. While these interviews generated many leads, none immediately identified the offender. The preservation of evidence became increasingly important as the investigation progressed without an arrest. Detectives retained clothing, biological samples, photographs, laboratory reports, and other physical evidence in accordance with evidence retention procedures. Although investigators could not anticipate the future development of forensic DNA technology, Maintaining the integrity of these materials ensured they would remain available for re-examination if scientific capabilities improved. During the following years, advances in forensic science gradually transformed homicide investigations across the United States. DNA profiling emerged during the 1980s and became increasingly sophisticated during the 1990s and 2000s. Cold case investigators throughout the country began reviewing unsolved homicides to determine whether preserved biological evidence could now be analyzed using modern techniques. The Carla Walker investigation would eventually become one of those cases, because the original investigators had carefully collected, documented, and preserved forensic evidence decades earlier. Later generations of investigators were able to submit that evidence for modern DNA analysis. The work performed in 1974 therefore remained directly relevant many years later, demonstrating an enduring principle of homicide investigation. Careful evidence preservation can create investigative opportunities long after a crime has occurred. Today, the early forensic work conducted in the Carla Walker case is frequently cited as an example of why comprehensive evidence collection remains essential, even when available technology cannot immediately provide answers. The investigation illustrates that scientific progress often depends not only on new laboratory methods, but also on the diligence of investigators who preserve evidence with the expectation that future advances may reveal information unavailable at the time of the original crime. Following the initial homicide investigation in 1974, the murder of Carla Walker gradually became one of the longest-running unsolved homicide cases in Fort Worth, Texas. Although investigators pursued numerous leads during the months immediately after the crime, no suspect was identified through the investigative methods available at the time. As active leads diminished, the case entered what law enforcement refers to as a cold case, an investigation that remains open but lacks sufficient new information to identify or prosecute an offender. During the 1970s, homicide investigators relied primarily on eyewitness testimony, fingerprint comparisons, trace evidence, and conventional laboratory examinations. While these methods successfully solved many crimes, they were often insufficient when an offender had little or no prior contact with law enforcement, or when physical evidence could not be directly associated with a known individual. In Carla Walker's case, investigators had preserved important biological evidence, but the scientific techniques necessary to fully analyze it had not yet been developed. Throughout the late 1970s and into the 1980s, detectives periodically reviewed the investigative file. Such reviews are a common practice in long-term homicide investigations. Fresh investigators often examine earlier reports in the hope of identifying overlooked details, inconsistencies, or investigative opportunities that may not have been apparent during the original inquiry. In this case, investigators re-interviewed some witnesses, compared information against reports of similar crimes, and evaluated newly received tips from members of the public. As the years passed, forensic science underwent profound changes. During the mid-1980s, DNA profiling emerged as a new forensic tool. Initially, its use was limited by the quality and quantity of available biological evidence, as well as by the capabilities of early laboratory techniques. Nevertheless, investigators responsible for unsolved homicides across the United States recognized that preserved biological evidence might eventually become suitable for testing as the science matured. By the 1990s, DNA analysis had become an increasingly important component of criminal investigations. laboratories developed more sensitive methods capable of generating DNA profiles from smaller and older biological samples. At the same time, national DNA databases expanded, allowing investigators to compare forensic profiles against samples collected from convicted offenders under applicable laws. Although these developments significantly improved homicide investigations, they did not immediately resolve every cold case. Many investigations, including Carla Walker's, still depended on whether usable DNA evidence had been preserved and whether a matching reference sample existed. The Fort Worth Police Department continued to maintain the Carla Walker case as an active, unsolved homicide. Detectives preserved evidence, maintained investigative records, and monitored advances in forensic science that might permit renewed laboratory analysis. This long-term commitment reflected a broader trend among law enforcement agencies, many of which established dedicated cold case units responsible for periodically reviewing unresolved homicides. Cold case investigations differ from active investigations in several important respects. Rather than responding to newly developing events, investigators focus on reassessing existing evidence. They review original crime scene documentation, laboratory reports, witness interviews, and physical evidence using contemporary investigative methods. Advances in forensic biology, digital record management, and evidence preservation have allowed many historical investigations to be re-examined in ways that were impossible when the crimes originally occurred. Public interest in unresolved homicide cases also evolved during this period. Families of victims frequently worked with advocacy organizations, media outlets, and law enforcement agencies to keep attention focused on unsolved crimes. Public appeals sometimes generated new witness information or encouraged individuals with previously unknown knowledge to contact investigators. Although not every tip proved significant, continued public awareness occasionally contributed to renewed investigative activity. For Carla Walker's family, the passage of time did not diminish the impact of the crime. Like many families affected by unsolved homicides, they experienced decades of uncertainty while the investigation remained open. Public statements made over the years reflected their hope that continuing advances in forensic science might eventually provide investigators with new opportunities to identify the person responsible. Meanwhile, developments in evidence preservation became increasingly important. Investigators recognized that biological material collected decades earlier could become more valuable as laboratory technology improved. Consequently, maintaining proper chain of custody, secure storage conditions, and complete documentation became essential elements of long-term homicide investigation. The integrity of preserved evidence would later determine whether modern forensic analysis could be performed reliably. By the early 21st century, many law enforcement agencies across the United States had successfully reopened historical homicide investigations through improved DNA testing. These developments encouraged investigators working on older cases to revisit evidence previously considered inconclusive. The Carla Walker investigation became one of many cases reviewed in light of advancing forensic capabilities, illustrating how scientific progress can create new investigative opportunities long after a crime has occurred. Although no immediate breakthrough emerged during those early reviews, the preservation of evidence ensured that the investigation remained capable of benefiting from future scientific innovations. Detectives understood that unresolved homicide investigations should not be considered permanently unsolvable simply because available technology had reached its limits. Instead, they recognized that each advancement in forensic science presented another opportunity to examine historical evidence using methods unavailable to previous generations. The decades during which the Carla Walker investigation remained unsolved therefore represent an important chapter in the history of cold case investigation. They demonstrate the importance of institutional persistence, comprehensive record keeping, and careful evidence preservation. While the identity of the offender remained unknown during this period, the investigative foundation established in 1974 continued to support future inquiry, ultimately allowing later generations of investigators to apply scientific techniques that would transform the course of the case many years after the original crime. As the Carla Walker homicide investigation entered its second and third decades without an arrest, the case increasingly reflected a challenge faced by many law enforcement agencies throughout the United States: how to preserve the possibility of future justice when contemporary investigative methods had reached their limits. Although detectives had exhausted many traditional leads, they continued to maintain the case file, preserve physical evidence, and monitor developments in forensic science that might eventually provide new opportunities for examination. Evidence preservation became the central factor that distinguished the Carla Walker investigation from many older homicide cases in which physical evidence had been lost, destroyed, or degraded over time. From the earliest stages of the investigation, detectives and crime scene personnel had retained biological samples, clothing, photographs, laboratory reports, and detailed documentation of the original crime scene. At the time these materials were collected, investigators could not know precisely how future scientific techniques might analyze them. Nevertheless, established forensic practice emphasized preserving potentially significant evidence whenever feasible. During the 1980s and 1990s, forensic laboratories underwent substantial technological transformation. DNA profiling gradually became a routine investigative tool in criminal cases, replacing or supplementing older techniques such as blood typing and microscopic hair comparison. Laboratories improved their ability to recover genetic material from increasingly small or degraded biological samples. Cases that had once depended almost entirely on eyewitness testimony or circumstantial evidence now benefited from highly discriminating biological analysis. Despite these advances, applying new technology to historical investigations required careful planning. Detectives first needed to determine whether preserved evidence remained suitable for testing after many years in storage. Forensic laboratories assessed the condition of biological samples, verified chain of custody documentation, and evaluated whether sufficient material remained for modern DNA analysis. These assessments were critical because improper storage or incomplete documentation could compromise the evidentiary value of physical evidence. The Carla Walker investigation benefited from comprehensive evidence management. Records maintained by the Fort Worth Police Department documented the collection, storage, and handling of key forensic exhibits over the years. This continuity allowed later investigators to identify which items were most likely to yield useful genetic information under contemporary laboratory techniques. Cold case investigations during this period increasingly relied upon collaboration between detectives and forensic scientists. Rather than assuming earlier laboratory conclusions were final, investigators periodically consulted with specialists regarding newly available testing methods. As DNA technology became more sophisticated, evidence that had once produced only limited information could often be re-examined using more sensitive analytical procedures. At the same time, the legal framework governing forensic evidence continued to evolve. Courts established increasingly rigorous standards concerning laboratory accreditation, evidence handling, expert testimony, and scientific reliability. Any future prosecution based upon newly analyzed evidence would require investigators to demonstrate not only that the scientific conclusions were reliable, but also that the evidence had been continuously preserved according to accepted legal standards. Consequently, meticulous record-keeping remained as important as scientific innovation itself. While the early 2000s advances in short tandem repeat, stranger, DNA profiling had significantly expanded the capabilities of forensic laboratories. These methods allowed analysts to develop DNA profiles from biological evidence that would previously have been unsuitable for testing. Investigators reviewing historical homicide cases throughout the country began reassessing preserved evidence to determine whether modern laboratory methods might now produce meaningful results. The Carlo Walker investigation remained among those periodically reviewed. Detectives revisited the original investigative file, examined laboratory reports, and evaluated preserved evidence with assistance from forensic specialists. While no immediate identification resulted from these early reviews, each reassessment contributed to a more complete understanding of what evidence remained available and which scientific methods might prove valuable in the future. Another important development during this period was the expansion of DNA databases. Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, technology enabled forensic laboratories to compare crime scene DNA profiles with profiles collected from qualifying offenders, and in some cases, with profiles associated with other unsolved crimes. Although database searches did not initially identify the individual responsible for Carlo Walker's murder, the continued preservation of forensic evidence ensured that additional opportunities remained as databases expanded and analytical methods improved. Cold case investigators also recognized the importance of maintaining institutional knowledge. Investigations extending across several decades inevitably involve changes in personnel as detectives retire or assume new assignments. Comprehensive documentation, including investigative reports, evidence inventories, crime scene photographs, laboratory findings, and witness interviews allowed successive investigators to understand earlier investigative decisions without repeating work already completed. This continuity proved essential in preserving the integrity of long-term homicide investigations. By the late 2000s and early 2010s, forensic science had entered another period of rapid development. Laboratories adopted increasingly sensitive DNA testing techniques capable of generating profiles from minute quantities of biological material. Investigators throughout the United States began reopening historical homicide investigations with renewed optimism that preserved evidence might now reveal information unavailable to previous generations of detectives. The Carlo Walker investigation exemplified this broader transformation in cold case methodology. Rather than viewing unsolved cases as permanently inactive, law enforcement agencies increasingly regarded them as investigations awaiting scientific opportunity. Evidence collected decades earlier continued to retain investigative value because it had been carefully preserved according to professional standards. Ultimately, the years devoted to preserving evidence were not simply a period of inactivity. They represented an essential phase of the investigation during which detectives safeguarded the materials that would later become central to renewed forensic examination. The patience shown by investigators, combined with advances in laboratory science and evidence management, ensured that when new analytical techniques finally became available, the Carlo Walker case remained positioned to benefit from them. The groundwork established during these decades would soon allow investigators to revisit the evidence with tools that had been unimaginable when the homicide first occurred in 1974. By the beginning of the 21st century, the scientific landscape of criminal investigation had changed dramatically from what investigators faced in 1974. DNA analysis, once an experimental laboratory technique, had become a central component of homicide investigations throughout the United States. Improvements in extraction methods, amplification technology, and statistical interpretation enabled forensic laboratories to obtain reliable genetic profiles from biological evidence that had remained in storage for decades. These developments encouraged law enforcement agencies to revisit many long unsolved homicide cases, including the murder of Carla Walker. The Fort Worth Police Department periodically reviewed the Walker investigation as forensic capabilities advanced. Cold case detectives examined the original investigative file alongside preserved evidence, evaluating whether newly available laboratory methods could provide information that earlier examinations had been unable to produce. Such reviews are a standard practice in long-term homicide investigations and reflect the understanding that scientific progress can alter the investigative value of evidence collected many years earlier. A key factor in the renewed examination of the case was the condition of the preserved biological evidence. Because investigators in 1974 had collected and maintained evidence according to accepted forensic procedures, later analysts were able to reassess it using modern DNA testing techniques. Preservation of chain of custody documentation and secure evidence storage ensured that the material remained suitable for laboratory analysis and retained its evidentiary integrity. As DNA technology became more sensitive, forensic laboratories developed the ability to generate complete or partial genetic profiles from increasingly small biological samples. These improvements expanded the number of historical cases that could benefit from renewed testing. Biological material that might once have been considered insufficient for meaningful analysis could now provide valuable investigative information when processed using contemporary methods. During this period, the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, also became an important investigative resource. CODIS allows participating forensic laboratories to compare DNA profiles obtained from crime scene evidence with profiles collected under applicable laws from convicted offenders, certain arrestees in qualifying jurisdictions, and evidence from other criminal investigations. Detectives working on cold cases routinely submitted eligible DNA profiles for comparison through these databases in the hope of identifying previously unknown suspects or linking separate investigations. Publicly available information indicates that investigators continued evaluating the Carla Walker evidence as forensic methods improved. Although early database comparisons did not immediately identify the offender, the continued existence of a usable DNA profile preserved the possibility that future technological developments or additional investigative strategies might generate new leads. At the same time, forensic science was expanding beyond traditional database comparisons. Researchers and investigators explored methods of using genetic information to generate investigative leads even when no direct database match existed. These emerging approaches would later become known as investigative genetic genealogy, a technique that combines forensic DNA analysis with genealogical research to identify possible relatives of an unknown individual. During the early stages of its development, however, the technique remained experimental and was applied only in limited circumstances. The reopening of historical homicide investigations required close collaboration between detectives, forensic biologists, prosecutors, and laboratory personnel. Before any new testing could proceed, investigators reviewed the original evidence inventories, verified chain of custody records, and selected items most likely to yield informative DNA results. Laboratories then determined whether sufficient biological material remained for modern analysis while ensuring that testing procedures met contemporary scientific and legal standards. Cold case investigations also benefited from advances in digital information management. Historical investigative files that once existed solely in paper form were increasingly digitized, allowing detectives to search reports, compare witness statements, and review photographs more efficiently. Although digitization did not alter the underlying evidence, it improved investigators' ability to reassess complex cases spanning several decades. Throughout this renewed investigative effort, detectives remained cautious not to rely solely on technological advances. DNA evidence, while highly informative, represents only one component of a comprehensive criminal investigation. Investigators continued examining witness statements, reviewing historical reports, comparing timelines, and evaluating whether new information from the public could corroborate scientific findings. This integrated approach reflected established investigative practice, in which forensic evidence and conventional detective work complement one another. The Carla Walker investigation exemplified a broader trend occurring across the United States during the 2000s and 2010s. Numerous law enforcement agencies revisited unsolved homicides from previous decades as forensic capabilities improved. Cases once considered unlikely to be solved gradually became candidates for renewed investigation because preserved evidence could now be analyzed using methods unavailable when the crimes originally occurred. By the late 2010s, advances in DNA science had reached a point where investigators possessed investigative options that earlier generations could scarcely have imagined. Highly sensitive laboratory techniques expanded DNA databases, and the emerging field of investigative genetic genealogy created new opportunities for identifying unknown offenders. Detectives responsible for the Carla Walker investigation recognized that the careful preservation of evidence since 1974 had positioned the case to benefit from these scientific developments. The reopening of the investigation therefore represented more than a routine review of an old case. It reflected decades of progress in forensic biology, evidence management, and criminal investigation. Every laboratory improvement, every enhancement in DNA analysis, and every advancement in evidence preservation increased the possibility that biological material collected more than 40 years earlier might finally reveal information capable of advancing the investigation. The work of the original investigators, combined with the persistence of later generations of detectives and forensic scientists, laid the foundation for the next phase of the case, one in which modern genetic analysis would provide investigative leads that had been impossible to obtain in 1974. The legal proceedings in the Carla Walker case illustrate how a criminal prosecution may proceed decades after a homicide when advances in forensic science produce new investigative evidence. Although the crime occurred in February 1974, the prosecution did not begin until 2020 after investigators identified Glenn Samuel McCurley as a suspect through renewed forensic analysis. The case demonstrates the interaction between historical evidence, modern DNA testing, investigative review, and the legal standards required to obtain a conviction. One of the most significant aspects of the prosecution was that it relied upon evidence preserved during the original investigation. Physical evidence collected in 1974 had remained in official custody for decades, allowing forensic laboratories to conduct additional testing using methods unavailable at the time of the homicide. Before any scientific findings could be introduced in court, prosecutors were required to establish that the evidence had been properly collected, preserved, and maintained through an unbroken chain of custody. Demonstrating this continuity is an essential requirement because it allows the court to evaluate the reliability and authenticity of forensic evidence. Modern DNA analysis became a central component of the renewed investigation. According to publicly documented court proceedings and law enforcement statements, biological evidence preserved from the original investigation was re-examined using contemporary laboratory techniques. Investigators ultimately compared the resulting DNA profile with DNA lawfully obtained from Glenn Samuel McCurley during the investigation. The reported laboratory results indicated that the biological evidence recovered in 1974 was consistent with McCurley's DNA profile, providing investigators with a significant evidentiary basis for pursuing criminal charges. While DNA evidence played a major role, it was not presented in isolation. Prosecutors also relied upon historical investigative records prepared during the original homicide investigation. These records included witness interviews, crime scene documentation, evidence inventories, and reports created by detectives and forensic personnel in 1974. Such documentation allowed investigators to reconstruct the chronology of the offense and demonstrate how evidence had been preserved over many decades. The legal process also reflected the distinction between investigative leads and admissible evidence. Information developed during renewed investigative efforts helped identify a suspect, but prosecutors were required to support the criminal case with evidence that satisfied applicable rules of evidence and constitutional standards. DNA findings therefore formed part of a broader evidentiary presentation rather than serving as the sole basis for prosecution. Another notable aspect of the proceedings involved the passage of time. More than 4 decades had elapsed between the offense and the filing of charges. Historical prosecutions of this nature often present practical challenges, including the availability of witnesses, the condition of documentary records, and the need to explain investigative decisions made under the scientific limitations of an earlier era. In the Carla Walker case, preserved evidence and detailed investigative files allowed prosecutors to address many of these issues by demonstrating the continuity of the investigation over time. The prosecution also highlighted the evolving role of forensic science within the criminal justice system. In 1974, investigators lacked the technology necessary to generate the type of DNA evidence later presented in court. Rather than suggesting deficiencies in the original investigation, the case illustrates how scientific developments can increase the evidentiary value of material that had already been responsibly collected and preserved. Cortez routinely evaluates such evidence according to contemporary scientific standards while considering the circumstances under which it was originally obtained. In 2021, after the trial had begun and evidence was being presented, Glenn Samuel McCurley changed his plea to guilty. By entering a guilty plea, the case concluded without the need for the jury to reach a verdict after full deliberation. The court subsequently sentenced him to life imprisonment under Texas law. Public reporting indicates that members of Carla Walker's family and Rodney McCoy addressed the court regarding the long-term impact of the crime and the decades during which the case remained unresolved. From a legal perspective, the case has become an important example of the prosecution of historical homicide investigations. It demonstrates that the successful resolution of a cold case depends not only upon scientific advances, but also upon careful evidence preservation, meticulous documentation, adherence to constitutional procedures, and the ability of prosecutors to present reliable evidence meeting modern evidentiary standards. The Carla Walker prosecution is therefore frequently cited in discussions of cold case litigation as an illustration of how decades-old investigations can proceed through the contemporary criminal justice system when supported by preserved forensic evidence and legally admissible scientific analysis. The prosecution of the Carla Walker case demonstrates how courts evaluate forensic DNA evidence within the broader framework of criminal procedure. Although DNA analysis became one of the most significant forms of evidence presented during the investigation, the court did not treat it as conclusive in isolation. Instead, the legal process focused on whether the scientific testing was reliable, whether the evidence had been lawfully obtained and preserved, and whether the results could be supported by other independently verified facts. Before DNA evidence could be considered, investigators and prosecutors first established the integrity of the physical evidence collected in 1974. Chain of custody, the documented record showing who collected, handled, transported, and stored each evidentiary item was a central issue. Court tests require prosecutors to demonstrate that evidence has remained substantially unchanged from the time of collection until laboratory examination. In historical homicide cases spanning several decades, this documentation is particularly important because numerous investigators, laboratory personnel, and evidence custodians may have handled the materials over many years. The Carla Walker investigation benefited from detailed evidence preservation. Publicly available court records indicate that biological evidence collected during the original homicide investigation remained available for modern forensic testing. Because investigators had maintained appropriate records regarding storage and handling, forensic laboratories were able to conduct contemporary DNA analysis while preserving the evidentiary value of the material. A second consideration involved the scientific reliability of the laboratory methods themselves. Modern forensic DNA testing relies upon validated analytical procedures performed in accredited laboratories operating under established quality assurance standards. Expert witnesses typically explain laboratory protocols, contamination safeguards, statistical interpretation, and peer review procedures to help the court understand how the DNA profile was developed and why the results are considered scientifically reliable. Understanding how forensic laboratories generate DNA profiles begins with the amplification of very small amounts of genetic material through the PCR enables analysts to make millions of copies of specific regions of DNA, allowing accurate profiling even when only limited biological material is available. In historical investigations, where samples may have aged or degraded over decades, careful application of validated PCR methods has become an essential component of modern forensic science. The court also considered the distinction between identification and interpretation. A DNA profile can indicate that biological material originated from a particular individual with a very high statistical degree of certainty, but the court must still determine how that evidence fits within the factual circumstances of the case. DNA evidence alone does not establish every element of a criminal offense. Prosecutors therefore presented the forensic findings alongside investigative records, witness testimony, crime scene documentation, and other corroborating evidence. Expert testimony played an important role throughout the proceedings. Forensic scientists explained the laboratory procedures used to examine the evidence, described the safeguards implemented to prevent contamination, and interpreted the statistical significance of the DNA comparisons. Cortez evaluates such testimony under established evidentiary standards designed to ensure that scientific opinions presented to juries are based upon reliable methodology and accepted professional practice. The defense also possessed the opportunity to examine the forensic evidence through the adversarial process. Criminal procedure permits defense counsel to review laboratory reports, question expert witnesses, challenge scientific conclusions where appropriate, and examine whether investigative procedures complied with constitutional and evidentiary requirements. This process is intended to ensure that forensic evidence is subjected to careful judicial scrutiny rather than accepted without examination. Another significant legal consideration involved the passage of time. More than 4 decades had elapsed between the homicide and the prosecution. Cortez recognized that historical cases may involve unavailable witnesses, faded memories, or investigators who have retired. For this reason, contemporaneous documentation created during the original investigation becomes especially valuable. That had passed. Publicly documented proceedings indicate that Glenn Samuel McCurley ultimately entered a guilty plea during the trial in 2021. As a result, the case concluded without the jury completing deliberations on all of the evidence presented. Nevertheless, the legal proceedings demonstrated how historical forensic evidence can satisfy modern evidentiary requirements when investigators have preserved physical evidence properly and laboratories apply scientifically validated analytical methods. The Carla Walker prosecution has since been discussed within legal and forensic communities as an example of the careful relationship between scientific advancement and judicial process. DNA analysis provided a powerful investigative and evidentiary tool, but its effectiveness depended upon lawful evidence collection, meticulous preservation, validated laboratory procedures, expert testimony, and judicial oversight. The case illustrates that courts evaluate forensic science not simply by considering the technological capabilities of modern laboratories, but by examining the complete evidentiary foundation supporting the scientific conclusions presented during criminal proceedings. After decades as an unsolved homicide, the Carla Walker investigation advanced significantly when renewed forensic testing identified Glenn Samuel McCurley as a suspect. Investigators with the Fort Worth Police Department reopened the case using modern DNA analysis on biological evidence that had been preserved from the original 1974 investigation. According to public court records and law enforcement statements, investigators lawfully obtained a DNA sample from McCurley during the renewed investigation. The resulting laboratory analysis reported that the DNA profile was consistent with biological evidence collected during the original homicide investigation. Investigators considered this result, together with the historical investigative record, sufficient to establish probable cause for an arrest. On April 22, 2020, the Fort Worth Police Department announced McCurley's arrest in connection with the murder of Carla Walker. He was charged with capital murder under Texas law as it applied to the alleged offense. Because the homicide occurred during the course of another felony, prosecutors pursued the charge under the statutes in effect for the offense. Following his arrest, McCurley appeared before the court for the initial stages of the criminal proceedings. As in all criminal prosecutions in the United States, he was presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty in court or until he entered a guilty plea. The prosecution was required to disclose evidence to the defense, and the case proceeded through the pretrial process in accordance with Texas criminal procedure. Publicly available records indicate that prosecutors relied on a combination of preserved forensic evidence, laboratory DNA analysis, historical investigative reports, witness statements from the original investigation, and expert testimony prepared by forensic scientists. The defense was afforded the opportunity to examine the evidence, review laboratory findings, and challenge the prosecution's case through the judicial process. The arrest represented the culmination of decades of investigative work rather than the conclusion of the legal process. Once formal charges were filed, the focus shifted from identifying a suspect to determining whether the available evidence would satisfy the legal standard required for conviction in a court of law. The subsequent proceedings ultimately concluded in 2021 when McCurley entered a guilty plea and was sentenced to life imprisonment. From a historical perspective, the Carla Walker case is frequently cited as an example of how advances in forensic DNA analysis, combined with careful evidence preservation and sustained investigative review, can lead to the resolution of a homicide investigation many decades after the original crime. The resolution of the Carla Walker homicide has become a notable example in discussions of modern cold case investigations because it demonstrates how advances in forensic science can transform evidence collected decades earlier into evidence capable of supporting a criminal prosecution. While the case itself was unique in its facts, many of the investigative principles it illustrates have broader significance for law enforcement agencies responsible for unresolved homicides. One of the clearest lessons concerns the long-term value of evidence preservation. Detectives investigating the homicide in 1974 collected biological evidence, documented crime scenes, and maintained investigative records according to the standards available at the time. Although DNA profiling had not yet been developed, preserving those materials allowed later generations of forensic scientists to apply technologies that were unavailable during the original investigation. The case is frequently cited as an example of why homicide evidence is often retained indefinitely whenever possible. Modern DNA analysis played a central role in the renewed investigation. Laboratory methods capable of recovering and analyzing genetic material have improved substantially since the 1970s. Highly sensitive testing can now generate DNA profiles from biological samples that would once have produced little or no usable information. These advances have encouraged law enforcement agencies throughout the United States to re-examine historical evidence preserved in unsolved homicide investigations. A key laboratory technique that made many historical DNA examinations possible is the polymerase chain reaction, PCR, which amplifies extremely small quantities of DNA into amounts suitable for forensic analysis. PCR does not identify a suspect by itself. Instead, it enables laboratories to create enough genetic material for reliable DNA profiling, particularly when working with limited or aged biological samples recovered from historical investigations. The case also reinforced the importance of maintaining a documented chain of custody. Cortez require investigators to demonstrate that evidence has remained securely preserved from collection through laboratory examination. Because the Carla Walker evidence was maintained according to established procedures, forensic analysts could perform modern testing while preserving the evidentiary integrity necessary for judicial review. This aspect of the case is frequently discussed in professional training programs involving evidence management and long-term investigations. Another important lesson involves the relationship between scientific innovation and traditional investigative work. DNA evidence did not replace conventional detective methods. Rather, it complemented decades of investigative records, witness interviews, crime scene documentation, and prosecutorial review. The successful resolution of the case depended on the combined efforts of original investigators, cold case detectives, forensic biologists, laboratory personnel, and prosecutors working across different generations. The investigation has also contributed to broader discussions regarding investment in cold case units. Many police departments have expanded dedicated teams responsible for reviewing historical homicide files, identifying preserved biological evidence, and determining whether advances in forensic science justify renewed laboratory testing. Such reviews are now considered an important component of long-term homicide investigation rather than an exceptional measure. Forensic laboratories likewise continue refining methods for analyzing degraded biological material. Improvements in DNA extraction, amplification, contamination prevention, statistical interpretation, and laboratory quality assurance have increased confidence in the reliability of forensic genetic evidence presented during criminal proceedings. Historical cases like Carla Walker's illustrate the practical benefits of these scientific developments while emphasizing the importance of validated laboratory protocols and independent review. Beyond its forensic significance, the case has influenced professional education. Law enforcement academies, forensic science programs, and legal training courses frequently use historical cold cases to examine topics such as evidence preservation, chain of custody, laboratory accreditation, expert testimony, and the interaction between scientific evidence and criminal procedure. The Carla Walker investigation provides a practical example of how each of these components contributes to the eventual resolution of a homicide investigation. The case also serves as a reminder that scientific progress alone cannot resolve every cold case. Many historical investigations lack preserved biological evidence or contain evidence that has deteriorated beyond useful analysis. Others present legal or factual challenges that cannot be overcome through forensic testing alone. Consequently, investigators continue to rely upon comprehensive case review, witness development, documentary analysis, and cooperation between agencies alongside advances in laboratory science. In the broader history of forensic investigation, the Carla Walker case reflects the evolution of homicide investigation over nearly half a century. It demonstrates how careful evidence preservation, continuous institutional commitment, advances in DNA technology, and adherence to established legal standards can combine to provide new investigative opportunities long after a crime has occurred. For investigators, forensic scientists, prosecutors, and students of criminal justice, the case remains an important example of how scientific development can enhance rather than replace the fundamental principles of careful criminal investigation. The ability to solve many historical homicide investigations often depends not on a single technological breakthrough, but on decisions made at the very beginning of an investigation. Among the most important of these decisions is the careful preservation of physical evidence. Biological samples, clothing, fingerprints, photographs, crime scene documentation, and laboratory records may appear to have limited investigative value when first collected, yet decades later they can become the foundation of entirely new forensic examinations. Crime scene preservation begins immediately after investigators secure a location. Every item that may have evidentiary value is photographed, documented, packaged, and labeled before being removed. Investigators record precisely where each item was found, who collected it, and the time of collection. These records establish the beginning of the chain of custody, a continuous history that demonstrates how evidence has been handled from the crime scene through laboratory analysis and eventual courtroom presentation. Proper packaging is equally important. Different forms of evidence require different storage conditions to minimize degradation or contamination. Biological evidence is generally dried before storage to reduce moisture that could encourage microbial growth. Clothing, swabs, and other biological materials are commonly packaged in breathable paper containers rather than sealed plastic bags when long-term preservation is anticipated. These procedures help maintain the integrity of DNA and other trace evidence. Once collected, evidence enters secure storage managed by evidence custodians. Access is controlled and documented, ensuring that every transfer of evidence is recorded. Maintaining this chain of custody protects both the integrity of the evidence and the fairness of future judicial proceedings. If investigators cannot demonstrate that evidence remains secure and unaltered, its reliability may be challenged during legal proceedings. Many historical investigations benefited from careful preservation even before DNA profiling existed. During the 1970s and early 1980s, investigators frequently collected biological material because it could assist blood typing or other laboratory examinations available at the time. Although these methods had limited discriminatory power compared with modern DNA analysis, preserving the original material meant that future scientists could revisit the same evidence using more advanced techniques. One of the developments that transformed historical investigations was the increasing sensitivity of DNA analysis. Modern laboratories are capable of recovering genetic information from biological samples that would once have been considered too small, too old, or too degraded for examination. This progress has allowed investigators to revisit evidence stored for decades and, in some cases, obtain complete DNA profiles from material collected long before DNA profiling became a standard forensic tool. PCR works by repeatedly copying selected regions of DNA through controlled heating and cooling cycles, rather than creating new information. It produces sufficient quantities of existing genetic material so that laboratories can generate accurate DNA profiles from extremely limited biological samples. This capability has become especially valuable in historical investigations where only trace amounts of DNA remain. Preserved evidence also benefits from improvements in laboratory methodology beyond DNA amplification. Modern forensic laboratories employ highly standardized procedures to minimize contamination, verify analytical accuracy, and ensure reproducibility of results. Independent quality assurance programs, accreditation standards, and peer review have strengthened confidence in forensic conclusions presented during criminal investigations and court proceedings. Equally important is the preservation of documentation. Crime scene photographs, investigator notes, laboratory worksheets, witness interviews, and evidence inventories provide essential context for later forensic analysis. Scientific findings alone cannot reconstruct the circumstances of an investigation. Historical records allow modern investigators to understand how evidence was collected, where it originated, and how it relates to the broader investigative timeline. Cold case units routinely review preserved evidence as technology evolves, rather than assuming that earlier laboratory conclusions remain final. Investigators periodically evaluate whether newly available scientific techniques may provide additional information. This process reflects an important principle of forensic science. Evidence may acquire new investigative value as analytical capabilities improve. Evidence preservation has also influenced forensic policy. Many law enforcement agencies now maintain long-term or permanent retention policies for biological evidence associated with unsolved homicides and other serious crimes. Digital cataloging systems, climate-controlled storage facilities, and standardized evidence management procedures have further improved the ability to preserve materials over extended periods. Despite remarkable scientific progress, preservation alone does not guarantee that every historical investigation can be resolved. Some evidence may have deteriorated before collection, been exposed to environmental conditions, or contain insufficient biological material for meaningful analysis. In other cases, no biological evidence was recovered at all. Consequently, careful investigative work at the time of the original offense remains just as important as later scientific advances. The broader lesson for criminal justice is that evidence preservation represents an investment in future investigative possibilities. Detectives collecting evidence today cannot predict what technologies will exist decades from now. By preserving physical evidence carefully, maintaining detailed documentation, and protecting the chain of custody, investigators ensure that future generations of forensic scientists will have the greatest possible opportunity to apply new, scientific methods to unresolved criminal investigations. Cold case investigators are law enforcement professionals assigned to re-examine serious crimes that remain unsolved after traditional investigative leads have been exhausted. Unlike detectives responding to newly reported crimes, cold case investigators work with historical evidence, archived records, and advances in forensic science to determine whether new investigative opportunities exist. Their objective is not simply to review old files, but to evaluate unresolved cases using modern investigative methods while adhering to current legal and scientific standards. The first responsibility of a cold case investigator is a comprehensive review of the original investigative file. This includes examining incident reports, witness statements, crime scene photographs, laboratory reports, evidence inventories, search warrants, and correspondence generated during the initial investigation. Detectives seek to understand not only what was discovered, but also why certain investigative decisions were made, taking into account the scientific and legal limitations that existed at the time. Evidence management is another central responsibility. Investigators determine whether physical evidence has been preserved, whether chain of custody records remain complete, and whether biological or trace evidence may now be suitable for modern forensic examination. They work closely with evidence custodians and forensic laboratories to identify items that could benefit from contemporary testing methods unavailable when the crime originally occurred. Advances in forensic science have significantly expanded the responsibilities of cold case investigators. Rather than relying solely on witness testimony and conventional investigative techniques, detectives now collaborate with forensic biologists, fingerprint examiners, digital forensic specialists, forensic anthropologists, and prosecutors. This multidisciplinary approach allows investigators to evaluate historical evidence from multiple scientific perspectives. Cold case investigators also reassess witness information. Earlier interviews may reveal details whose significance was not recognized during the original investigation. In some instances, investigators locate and re-interview surviving witnesses using modern interview techniques. They may also identify previously unknown witnesses through historical records, media archives, or newly available public information. Digital technology has transformed historical case review. Many agencies have digitized investigative files, allowing detectives to search thousands of pages of reports efficiently. Geographic information systems, digital evidence management platforms, and computerized case databases enable investigators to compare historical cases more effectively and identify possible links between offenses committed across different owned jurisdictions. Interagency cooperation has become increasingly important in cold case work. Crimes committed decades earlier often involve multiple police departments, state investigative agencies, forensic laboratories, and prosecutors' offices. Information sharing between these organizations allows investigators to compare evidence, exchange expertise, and coordinate laboratory testing more efficiently than was possible in earlier decades. A significant portion of a cold case investigator's work involves evaluating whether new forensic testing is scientifically justified. Not every preserved item requires reanalysis. Detectives consult laboratory specialists to determine whether additional testing is likely to produce meaningful information while preserving sufficient evidence for any future examination. This careful assessment helps balance scientific opportunity with responsible evidence management. Legal considerations remain central throughout the investigative process. Detectives work closely with prosecutors to ensure that investigative methods comply with constitutional protections, evidentiary rules, and applicable criminal procedure. Because many cold cases ultimately proceed to court decades after the original offense, investigators must maintain meticulous documentation of every new investigative step undertaken during the reopened inquiry. Cold case investigations also present unique practical challenges. Witness memories may have faded, original investigators may have retired, and some documentary records may be incomplete. Detectives must therefore distinguish between verified historical facts and information that cannot be independently corroborated. Contemporary investigative decisions are based on available evidence rather than assumptions about events that occurred many years earlier. Public engagement sometimes contributes to renewed investigations. Law enforcement agencies may issue requests for information, release age-progressed images, or publicize historical evidence in an effort to encourage new witnesses to come forward. However, all information received must be carefully verified through established investigative procedures before it can influence the direction of an investigation. The work of cold case investigators illustrates the evolving nature of criminal investigation. Their efforts combine traditional detective work with modern forensic science, historical research, legal analysis, and interdisciplinary collaboration. By systematically reviewing preserved evidence and applying contemporary investigative methods, these investigators help ensure that unresolved cases continue to receive professional attention even after many years have passed. While not every cold case can be solved, the continued development of forensic science and investigative techniques has significantly expanded the opportunities available to investigators seeking to resolve historical crimes. Historical homicide investigations have played an important role in shaping modern forensic science and investigative practice. As forensic technology has advanced over the past several decades, many previously unsolved cases have demonstrated that successful criminal investigations depend not only on scientific innovation, but also on careful evidence collection, documentation, and long-term preservation. These experiences have influenced law enforcement procedures, laboratory standards, and legal practices worldwide. One of the most significant lessons concerns the importance of the initial crime scene response. The first investigators to arrive at a scene often make decisions that determine the quality of evidence available for years or even decades afterward. Securing the scene, preventing contamination, documenting the location thoroughly, and preserving physical evidence according to established protocols remain essential, regardless of whether current technology can immediately analyze every item collected. Evidence preservation has become a cornerstone of modern homicide investigation. Biological samples, fingerprints, trace materials, digital devices, photographs, and written documentation may all acquire greater investigative value as scientific methods evolve. Many agencies now maintain long-term retention policies for evidence associated with unsolved homicides because future analytical techniques may extract information unavailable at the time of collection. The development of forensic DNA analysis has transformed criminal investigations, but it has also reinforced an important principle. Scientific evidence is most effective when combined with traditional investigative work. Detectives continue to rely on witness interviews, crime scene reconstruction, documentary evidence, and corroborating information alongside laboratory findings. DNA can identify or exclude individuals, but investigators must still determine how those findings fit within the broader factual circumstances of the case. Another important lesson involves the role of quality assurance in forensic laboratories. Modern laboratories operate under rigorous accreditation standards, validated testing procedures, proficiency testing, and peer review. These safeguards are designed to ensure that scientific conclusions presented during criminal investigations and court proceedings are reliable, reproducible, and supported by established scientific methodology. Cold case investigations have also demonstrated the importance of interdisciplinary collaboration. Successful investigations increasingly involve detectives, forensic biologists, fingerprint specialists, forensic pathologists, digital forensic analysts, prosecutors, and evidence custodians working together throughout the investigative process. Each discipline contributes specialized expertise while maintaining common standards for evidence handling and documentation. Advances in digital technology have improved investigative efficiency. Electronic case management systems, searchable databases, geographic information systems, and digital evidence platforms enable investigators to organize large quantities of historical information more effectively than paper-based systems alone. These tools assist investigators in identifying patterns, comparing historical records, and managing complex investigations that span many years. The legal system has evolved alongside forensic science. Courts continue to require that scientific evidence satisfy established standards for admissibility, reliability, and relevance. Expert witnesses must explain laboratory methods clearly, while prosecutors must demonstrate that evidence has been collected, preserved, and analyzed according to accepted professional practices. These legal safeguards help ensure that scientific evidence is evaluated carefully within the judicial process. Historical homicide investigations also highlight the importance of ongoing professional education. Investigators and forensic scientists regularly receive training on new laboratory techniques, evidence management procedures, investigative methodologies, and legal developments. Continuous learning allows criminal justice professionals to incorporate scientific advances into practice while maintaining established investigative principles. Finally, one of the enduring lessons from decades of forensic development is that unresolved investigations should not necessarily be considered permanently unsolvable. Scientific progress has repeatedly expanded the range of evidence that can be analyzed and the methods available for interpreting it. At the same time, investigators recognize that technology alone cannot resolve every case. Careful documentation, professional judgment, ethical investigative practices, and respect for legal standards remain fundamental to every homicide investigation. Together, these lessons illustrate the continuing evolution of forensic science and criminal investigation. Modern investigative practice reflects decades of experience gained from both solved and unsolved cases, emphasizing that careful evidence preservation, rigorous scientific methodology, interdisciplinary cooperation, and adherence to legal standards collectively provide the strongest foundation for the pursuit of justice. Historical homicide investigations have played a significant role in the evolution of modern forensic science. Many investigative procedures now considered standard developed in response to lessons learned from earlier cases in which available scientific methods were limited or incomplete. As technology advanced, unresolved investigations became valuable opportunities for evaluating new laboratory techniques, refining evidence handling procedures, and improving cooperation between investigators, forensic scientists, and prosecutors. One of the most important developments has been the recognition that physical evidence should be collected and preserved as comprehensively as possible, even when its immediate value is uncertain. Investigators today routinely document crime scenes using high-resolution photography, detailed measurements, digital mapping, and standardized evidence collection protocols. These practices reflect decades of experience, demonstrating that evidence initially considered insignificant may later become highly informative as scientific capabilities improve. The preservation of biological evidence has become a defining principle of homicide investigation. During the 1970s, many investigations relied primarily on blood typing, fingerprint comparisons, and microscopic examinations of hair and fibers. Although these methods could provide useful investigative information, they often lacked the ability to identify a single individual with high certainty. The later development of forensic DNA profiling transformed the significance of preserved biological material, allowing laboratories to obtain highly discriminating genetic profiles from evidence collected many years earlier. PCR allows forensic scientists to produce sufficient DNA for laboratory testing from limited biological samples, making it possible to analyze evidence that previously could not generate usable results. Combined with increasingly sensitive analytical instruments and rigorous laboratory quality standards, PCR has become a foundational component of modern forensic DNA examination. Historical homicide investigations have also influenced evidence management practices. Law enforcement agencies now emphasize comprehensive chain of custody documentation from the moment evidence is collected until its presentation in court. Every transfer of an evidentiary item is recorded, helping to ensure that investigators can demonstrate its integrity throughout the investigative and judicial process. These procedures strengthen both scientific reliability and public confidence in forensic evidence. Another important lesson concerns the interdisciplinary nature of modern investigations. Earlier homicide investigations were often conducted primarily by detectives supported by crime laboratories. Contemporary investigations involve broader collaboration among forensic biologists, forensic pathologists, fingerprint specialists, digital forensic analysts, forensic anthropologists, evidence custodians, prosecutors, and legal advisors. This multidisciplinary approach allows investigators to interpret evidence from multiple scientific and legal perspectives. Digital technology has further reshaped homicide investigation. Crime scene documentation increasingly incorporates three-dimensional imaging, digital photography, geographic information systems, and electronic evidence management platforms. Historical case files are frequently digitized, enabling investigators to search large collections of reports efficiently, compare historical evidence across jurisdictions, and identify investigative connections that may not have been apparent during earlier reviews. Cold case investigations have encouraged continual scientific innovation, as laboratories developed increasingly sensitive methods for DNA extraction, amplification, sequencing, and statistical interpretation. Investigators revisited evidence collected decades earlier. This process demonstrated that unresolved investigations should not necessarily be considered permanently unsolvable. Instead, preserved evidence may acquire new investigative value as laboratory capabilities advance. Professional standards have also evolved significantly. Modern forensic laboratories typically operate under accreditation requirements, validated analytical procedures, proficiency testing, and quality assurance programs designed to ensure that scientific conclusions are reproducible and supported by established methodology. These safeguards have strengthened the reliability of forensic evidence presented in criminal investigations and judicial proceedings. Historical investigations have influenced legal practice as well. Courts have developed increasingly rigorous standards governing expert testimony, scientific evidence, and laboratory methodology. Judges evaluate whether forensic techniques are supported by accepted scientific principles, while prosecutors must establish that evidence has been collected, preserved, and analyzed according to recognized professional standards. This interaction between scientific progress and legal oversight has encouraged continuous improvement in both forensic practice and criminal procedure. Education and professional training have likewise benefited from historical homicide investigations. Universities, forensic science programs, police academies, and continuing education courses frequently use historical investigations as case studies to illustrate principles of crime scene management, evidence preservation, laboratory analysis, investigative reasoning, and ethical decision-making. These examples provide practical insight into how scientific developments influence investigative outcomes over time. Looking ahead, emerging technologies continue to shape forensic science. Advances in DNA sequencing, probabilistic genotyping, digital evidence analysis, artificial intelligence-assisted pattern recognition, and other validated forensic methodologies may further expand the ability of investigators to analyze historical evidence. As with previous scientific developments, these technologies will be most effective when combined with careful evidence preservation, rigorous laboratory procedures, interdisciplinary collaboration, and adherence to legal safeguards. Ultimately, the history of homicide investigation demonstrates that forensic science evolves through the combination of scientific innovation, professional discipline, and long-term institutional commitment. Every carefully documented crime scene, every securely preserved evidence item, and every improvement in laboratory methodology contributes to a broader body of knowledge that strengthens the criminal justice system. Historical homicide investigations have therefore not only resolved individual cases, but have also shaped the standards, technologies, and investigative practices that define modern forensic science today.